Okay, so get ready because today we are diving into a book that's causing a bit of a stir. Liberal Losers. And no, before you jump to any conclusions, it's not some kind of political slam piece.
Yeah, it's really not about labeling anyone
Exactly.
at all. It's more of a deep dive, right, into sociologist M. Seenarine's arguments about, well, the potential consequences of right-wing politics here in the
And
U.S.
we're focusing on the first two chapters just to give everyone a taste.
It's about understanding the why. Like, why is he making these arguments? And what I find so interesting right from the get-go is that in chapter 1, Seenarine actually lays out what he sees as the good stuff about liberal politics.
Hmm.
Universal health care, economic equality, all those things many liberals are really passionate about. Almost like he's setting up a baseline.
It's true. It's like he's saying, here's what we might be missing out on, like framing things like access to healthcare as a basic human right, advocating for civil rights.
Yeah.
These are crucial things, and he's sort of setting the stage for what he sees as potentially at risk.
Exactly. And that's where chapter 2 comes in. He goes headfirst into the potential downsides of right-wing politics, at least from his perspective.
Right. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, I think it's worth pausing to talk about Sonoran himself because his background is fascinating. I mean, this is someone who, he's the son of immigrants who worked on colonial plantations, so he's got this whole other layer of understanding about historical systems.
Totally. And now he's a sociology professor in Los Angeles, so he's looking at these systems in a modern context.
Hmm.
And that dedication, right, to Elijah McClain, man, it just hits you right in the gut.
It really does. It's a somber reminder that this is about real people's lives.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's dive into those arguments, shall we? One of the biggest things Centerine puts forward is this idea that when right-wing politics have the reins, the economy might start working really well, but mostly for the already wealthy.
Yeah, and not so much for everyone else. Like, he argues that this whole rising tide lifts all boats approach, you know, it doesn't quite hold up when you look at things like tax cuts for the rich or deregulation.
And for folks who aren't familiar with the term, deregulation is basically when the government loosens its grip on industries, which some people argue can lead to more freedom and economic growth. But as Centering points out, it can also lead to, well, instability. He even points to the 2008 financial crisis, like, hello, remember that?
Exactly. And this isn't just some abstract economic theory either. Scenery brings it down to earth.
Yeah.
Like, remember all those heated arguments about raising the minimum wage?
Oh, absolutely. It's always a hot topic.
Yeah. Well, Centering argues that resisting those increases basically traps people in these low-paying jobs. It just perpetuates this cycle of inequality he's concerned about. And hold on, because he doesn't stop at just economics. He also goes after, well, what he sees as the potential erosion of democratic institutions themselves.
Okay, so unpack that a little for us.
So he argues that restricting voting rights, which we've seen a lot of lately, is a huge red flag. And then there are the attacks on media.
Which, yeah, we can't ignore that.
Right. And he compares these tactics to, and I'm quoting here, hallmark tactics of authoritarian regimes.
Whoa. Okay, so we've got economic inequality, potential threats to democratic institutions. What else?
He brings up social issues, too.
Right.
He digs into the impact of conservative policies on women's rights, especially when it comes to reproductive health care.
Yeah.
Big one there.
And that's an area where his background as a sociologist really comes into play, right? He's not just looking at these issues as abstract political footballs. He's thinking about how they actually impact people's lives.
It's about the real-world consequences.
Exactly.
And speaking of real-world consequences, immigration is another one.
Right.
Centurion talks about how policies like family separation at the border, regardless of the intent, create a culture of fear.
That's a good point.
And some would even say it echoes historical patterns of exploitation.
Okay, so we've talked about the economy, democracy, social issues, immigration. I feel like we can't end this part of our deep dive without talking about the environment, right?
Of course, right. Like Centurion links the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Agreement, that global effort to tackle climate change, directly back to supporting the fossil fuel industry.
Which he argues, if I'm remembering correctly, is where the right's priorities lie.
You got it. And he believes that ultimately harms both the planet, and public health. He sees it as like a very short-sighted approach, putting immediate economic gain over long-term sustainability.
So it's not just about one specific policy, right? It's about the potential consequences of these shifts in values, these shifts in thinking about the role of government on the direction of the country as a whole.
Exactly. And he's arguing that these shifts often have the biggest impact on, well, the most vulnerable among us.
Which brings us back to that dedication to Elijah McClain, a young black man who died during a police encounter. It just underscores the fact that these aren't just intellectual exercises, right? We're talking about real people's lives here.
It's like he's drawing these lines, right, from these individual decisions to their larger consequences, and he's not just theorizing here.
Oh, no, not at all.
He brings in tons of historical examples.
Right, like actual evidence.
Exactly. Citing experts, you name it. He's illustrating these points with real-world situations so you can see the connections.
And that's what I think makes liberal losers so compelling. It's not just like some theoretical, heady thing. He
Yeah.
takes these complex ideas and makes them accessible to everyone, even if you've never looked at a political science book.
Exactly. And he even, like, names names.
Oh, yeah, he does.
He calls out specific people, groups, that he sees as really driving these agendas, which, by the way, not every author does that.
No, they don't. It definitely makes you pay attention.
And then he connects those individuals and organizations to the larger conservative movement.
It's fascinating.
Okay, but hold on a sec, because I want to make sure we're seeing the bigger picture here, right?
Mm.
You've got this professor, seenarine. He's analyzing all of this through a sociologist's lens, and he's laying out these potential downsides of right-wing politics. But there's something more going on here, isn't there? It's not just about, like, the policies themselves, is it?
Yeah, you're right. It feels like he's getting at something deeper.
It's about the underlying values and beliefs that are driving the policies. And what seenarine seems to be saying is that those values, when they're put into practice in this very specific way, can have these, well, pretty major ripple effects. Like, let's take something like individual liberty.
Okay, yeah, the idea that you should be free to make your own choices without the government always looking over your shoulder.
Exactly, which is a powerful idea. Like, who doesn't want more freedom, right?
Right.
But seenarine's asking us to consider, how does that value, that desire for individual liberty, translate into policy? Because when you start minimizing social safety nets or loosening environmental regulations in the name of freedom, is that actually limiting the freedom of others? You see what I mean?
Right, because my freedom shouldn't come at the expense of your freedom. It's about finding that balance.
Yes, exactly. And understanding that those beliefs, when they become policy, have consequences. And those consequences aren't always what we expect.
And they definitely don't impact everyone equally, which is a really important point to make. Because the reality is, when you start putting certain policies in place, some people benefit a lot, and some people, well, they get left behind.
Precisely. And seenarine is arguing that the people being left behind, more often than not, are those who are already the most vulnerable. And look, he's not saying that everyone on the right is a bad person or anything like that. Not at all.
Yeah, it's way more nuanced than that, right?
Way more nuanced. It's more about recognizing that even well-intentioned policies can have these unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And those consequences are not always felt equally by everyone.
Exactly. And this is where, we come back to that dedication to Elijah McClain. It's like this stark reminder that we're not just talking about these abstract political debates.
Yeah.
These have real-world consequences that can impact people's lives, really significantly.
This is what I find so fascinating about these deep dives. We're not just scratching the surface here. We are really trying to get into the heart of these complex issues.
And it's not about agreeing or disagreeing with the author either, right? It's about taking these ideas, even the ones that make you uncomfortable, and letting them spark some critical thinking.
Yes, exactly.
So, okay, we've talked about seenarine's background, his main arguments, the evidence he uses, the potential consequences of those arguments for us as individuals and for society. Well, we can't just stop there, right? There's always another side to consider.
Right. Because like you said, there are always multiple perspectives, especially with these kind of big, complex issues. So how do these arguments hold up against, like, opposing viewpoints? What are some of the counter arguments that seenarine might be pushing back against? It's like that saying there are two sides to every story.
Exactly.
So what would those other sides be?
Well, I think some people would argue that these right-wing policies, with all their emphasis on free markets, limited government, they'd say those actually create more opportunity for everyone.
Eventually, right.
Yeah, in the long
You
run.
feel like that rising tide really will lift all boats, but it just, takes a little time.
Right, exactly. Give it time to work its magic.
And that maybe deregulation in the end actually leads to more innovation and competition.
Which, could be good for consumers, right? Lower prices, more choices.
More options, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's the economic side of things. But what about all those social issues that centering brings up? I mean, there are definitely people out there who agree with those more conservative stances, right?
Absolutely. Like when it comes to, say, abortion or traditional family values, there are people who agree with those views.
Hmm.
And they'd argue that those stances come from a different set of values entirely.
And those values are just as important to them.
Exactly.
So it's not about saying one side is right and one side is wrong. It's more about understanding, like, what is the foundation that these arguments are built on, right?
Totally.
Like, where are these different perspectives actually coming from?
It's about having those tough conversations.
Right. Even when they're a little uncomfortable,
Yes. And maybe especially when they're uncomfortable.
because that's where the growth is.
100%, yeah.
Okay, so let's say someone finishes Liberal Losers, and they're like, huh, Sandrine, he actually makes some good points. Like, maybe I need to rethink a few things. What would you say to that?
I'd say awesome. Because isn't that the point, really? To get people thinking, to spark some self-reflection? Santorin, he's laying out his arguments. He's backing them up. But in the end, it's up to each individual to decide what sits right with them.
And to do their own homework.
Exactly. Don't just take his word for it.
This is just one piece of a much bigger
A
puzzle,
starting point.
a jumping off point.
Exactly.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive into Liberal Losers. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
We really have.
We've talked about those potential benefits of liberal politics, the potential downsides of right-wing politics, and then all the messy stuff in between.
And through it all, we've been highlighting this one really important thing.
What's that?
The importance of thinking critically,
Yes.
of questioning assumptions.
And listening to those different perspectives,
100%.
because at the end of the day, these are really complex issues with no easy answers.
They really are.
But what we can do always is try to understand where other people are coming from, keep those conversations going, and just, I don't know, work towards a future where everyone feels heard.
Well said. Because isn't that what it's all about?
I think so.
And sometimes it's a book like Liberal Losers, that pushes these buttons for people.
With its provocative title.
Exactly. The one that gets those conversations started.
Well, on that note, maybe this deep dive will inspire you to go check it out for yourself.
Yeah, see what you think.
And until next time, keep those questions coming.
And keep learning.